Well, as the nations around the globe contemplate how to deal with advances in technology and what it means for workforces, consultancy McKinsey and Company has crunched the numbers in Australia. It's found 25 to 46% of current work activities in Australia could be automated by 2030. That could see 5 million Australians changing professions and the unemployment rate jump by 2.5%. But the outlook isn't all grim, with the opportunity adding up to $4 trillion to the economy over the next 15 years.
Well, to discuss this, we're joined by law student Erika live from the Legal Forecast, a group run by young lawyers to help the profession adapt to digital disruption, and Charlie Taylor, a senior partner at McKinsey and Company and one of the report's authors. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having us here.
Charlie, let me start with you. Given you came out with this report, let me quote those figures back to you. 25 to 40%. 46% of the current workforce in Australia could be automated by 2030. That's only 11 years away. You're saying up to half of the workforce could be automated. Now, you go on to say it's a renaissance in productivity, personal income and economic growth. It's more than that. That's a revolution, is it not?
Well, it's a revolution which has been occurring over the last century. We've been progressively, technology has been changing the way we work. It will hopefully happen at a faster pace, because in fact our income growth has stalled over the last 10 years. It's fallen down to 1%. This is an opportunity to get income growth growing faster again.
But this report, it's painted in a positive light, looking at the opportunities, but is that underplaying what's likely to be lost here? And that's not just individual jobs and lots of them, but entire sections of industries will be gone. I'm talking about things like administration within companies could all be automated.
Certainly, there will be significant changes, more so in terms of tasks of existing jobs, but there will be some jobs that are going, particularly around information collection and processing. But the good news is we've also looked at where the jobs will be coming from, and we see that there will be the jobs of the future, particularly in sectors like healthcare and social assistance, education, which will for the retraining that will be required, even retail, based on people's income levels growing, there'll be demand in those areas.
Well, let's look a little more closely at one of those sectors, and this is where we're going to bring you in, Erika, as far as the law is concerned, and I guess it goes to what Charlie's saying as far as the processing of information is concerned. That's very much the law, isn't it?
In a way, I think that the law, I feel like that's a very narrow construction of the law, because what the law and lawyers do is also apply kind of human reasoning behind it.
It's interpretation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of the work in the legal system that will now be automated with things like artificial intelligence, being able to do the work that maybe young lawyers were doing before, looking through case studies. That can all now, or very soon, be done by artificial intelligence programs.
It can be. So e-discovery, I think, is the kind of sector for that. And that's actually been around from the 1970s, 1980s. So it's not necessarily new technology. I think that's a question that all of us at Legal Forecast and all the lawyers that we speak to think about a lot. It's whether those jobs will be replaced. And I think as law students, we do have a very existential crisis about what our futures hold. I think that in that, it's really kind of asking ourselves as a profession what we do, right? And I think that's a kind of deeply introspective one. And I think at the heart of law currently is a reflection about, cool, so you're dealing with humans, you're dealing with ideas of justice, you're dealing with ideas of human rights, you're dealing with truth. And a lot of these things are, in a way, things that you interpret as humans, but those things are also kind of norms that can be changed.
Charlie, is that something, would you agree with that? I mean, in as far as the law is concerned, can artificial intelligence replace a lawyer who, as we say, has to interpret what, that information?
It certainly will place some tasks, particularly the information collection and some processing, standard processing tasks. But I think it's a bit like medicine. There'll be enormous demand for people who can interpret and help people navigate through the systems, how to use the algorithms, etc. in place. So, and that's why, for example, in healthcare, and particularly with an ageing population, we see a big increase in demand for professionals serving in that sector.
What about the mining industry? Because that's probably one that most recently people have seen huge technological changes in. What does the mining industry tell you about what's likely to happen in other sectors?
Sure. So the mining industry, where we have the manual tasks or the information collection and processing tasks, they are being automated and at a faster rate, reflecting how globally competitive we are. The good thing is that will attract more investment into Australia because we are so competitive within that sector, but it does mean there will be less jobs in that sector.
And a lot less jobs, right? Because say for Rio Tinto, which has just come out with driverless trains, they in 2013 employed 400 train drivers on salaries of up to $240,000 a year, and now they will have need for very few of them.
Correct. In terms of train drivers, that's absolutely right. But in terms of the opportunities they have in developing the minerals, interpreting data, looking at other opportunities, there will be other jobs involved that will be created in that industry.
Erika, how's your cohort feeling about the future? I'm talking about the people that maybe just finished university or are at university thinking about what they may be doing for a career.
Yeah.
Is there great concern about the future because we're seeing such a vast turnover of jobs and how that landscape will change?
I think with all of us, I feel like there's a great existential crisis about our futures and where those futures kind of head. The headlines keep reading, oh, the robots are coming and, you know, the rise of AI is going to automate all our jobs out. But I think, as Charles kind of said, is that there's so many opportunities if you can look between the disciplines. If you look between law and technology, there are jobs that you can actually kind of invent jobs. So or just come up with different combinations of roles that allow you to then implement such systems. And I think something that we can't forget about when we do design these systems is just the role of humans, and that has to take a very, very human-centric focus. Because even if you think about, I think it's really frustrating sometimes we talk about technology as being this kind of black box, right? And the thing that we always forget in these sorts of discussions and debates is that when you look inside the black box, technologies are also built by humans, right? And there's incredible opportunity to put input into the types of technologies that are being built. And that kind of goes down to how you view technology as a social system.
Although, of course, we are teaching robots and computers how to think for themselves.
We are, and I think that goes around what parameters you use when you're building these sorts of technologies as well. So think about algorithmic bias, for example. We've seen the headlines about Microsoft's kind of Tay being a kind of politically incorrect sort of chatbot, and I think it's the decisions that engineers, developers, and designers of these technologies make, whether they kind of reflect social values, right? And that comes through in your education, that comes through in your understanding of the world, and whether you're conscious to the idea about, conscious to even the question of what's the cost on humanity when you design these sorts of technologies. If that question is even asked in the first place, that's a great thing. But I feel like a lot of the ethics and the morals around when you're designing technology is actually lost and not taught well enough.
You talked about their opportunities and the idea of inventing jobs, so we don't necessarily know exactly what those jobs are going to look like now. Do you think universities understand that? And are they doing enough in terms of maybe limiting student numbers or giving students a wider education, particularly, say, in the area of law, to make sure that graduates do have jobs at the end of their course? Yeah,
I've experienced this myself, actually. So I think that the choices out there are changing. I think McKinsey kind of noted that there's a UTS multidisciplinary bachelor's degree and I think that's an absolutely fantastic kind of course. And I think the thing about education sometimes is that you do kind of get more and more specialised as you go through the education system. So what's really frustrating is your careers advisor for primary school students, which really shouldn't be a thing. Let's think about that for a little bit. Are pushing us towards more and more of kind of specialised boxes of knowledge. And the really interesting stuff really does happen when you combine different disciplines together, and that I feel is changing, and I think the universities are realising this, and that's why we have combined law degrees, but I feel like it's not enough. But there's amazing courses that that start to work in this space.
Charlie, we talk about the fear, and that's understandable, isn't it? That so many people, particularly, I guess, older workers would be fearful about the future, but at the same time we talk about the opportunity. But you're saying that needs to be facilitated by the policymakers. How do they do that?
So I think the policymakers do need to think about how we reinvest in training, not only younger students, but also those who are already in the workforce. And I think we're seeing some very interesting things going on around the world, both what governments are doing and what companies are doing as well. So governments, for example, the government of Singapore has a lifelong learning account now for each citizen, whereby they can use a certain amount of funding, the hundreds of dollars that they can use to contribute to courses that they can retrain. And Amazon, for example, offers Careers Choices, a program where people can sign up to do courses after they've been there for a year, and they can study to do other degrees. 95% of that is paid for by the company.
But do you feel as though perhaps this transition could potentially be painful in the short term, where you'll see a spike in unemployment until it sorts itself out?
Yes, and that's what we point out, that's the challenge in these disruptions. The Australian workforce is incredibly mobile. Almost 20% of Australians change jobs almost on a yearly basis. Now, often that's going into the same role.
That's not
same type of
necessarily a
role.
good thing, though, is it?
Well, it's reflecting mobility and demand, and so that it's a reasonably mobile workforce. So I think we're actually in some ways quite well set up to do this, but it's going to happen at a faster pace. So we have, and it's for older workers, for example, it is more of a challenge, and that's where I think government policy and the role of corporates becomes important.
Yeah, what do you make of what a lot of technology companies are saying, that they're using artificial intelligence to complement jobs as opposed to replacing them? That's simply not correct, is it?
Well, I think it is correct that in many cases it's complementary, and it is providing better services for customers, and it is helping us become more productive and increase incomes levels. However, there are people who will therefore lose jobs, and that's where the role of governments and companies come in to help manage that transition.
Yeah, and you talk, it's a matter of flexibility. I mean, you feel as though that's the key, isn't it?
And I wanted to pick up on that, and I want to say that you talk about corporations also helping in terms of the transition and the education and the training that goes into jobs. But I think something that we also forget is that I feel like we look at this issue with a very, very almost short-term lens, right? If you take the view of historians and sociologists, you go back to the 1800s, when the first and the second industrial revolution, where we had these recurring dilemmas and we had these recurring debates. You can go to the work of the classic sociologists, and they were very much concerned with the same sort of things. I think Charles is absolutely right that the speed and velocity of how change will happen and that transformation will happen a lot faster because we live in a very, very complex but also very, very connected society. But at that, the benefit of that is that if you take the approach of being proactive about your learning and your retraining and your upskilling, all of that actually becomes a lot easier because you do have the internet and you do have the ability to look up things. How I got into law and technology was because I was a law student who was frustrated with their degree and almost the narrowness of it. And I literally Googled law and technology into Google and found a course that I could take and learn, and that just becomes absolutely empowering and amazing. But it's having that consciousness about how the world changes and what you can do about it.
Is it different for younger people like Erika, who maybe have that ability to adapt and learn new things, and say someone who's at the other end of the career spectrum where they're coming closer to retirement age, to get them to retrain and refocus on to a potentially brand new industry?
I think it is.
Yeah.
And this is part of the challenge, and I think that that's where there is that role for some support here in enabling that retraining.
And who does the retraining? Because employers aren't necessarily want to take on that burden, will they?
No. And that's where governments can play a role as well in terms of, and I gave the example of Singapore before with their lifelong learning. That is designed for the older worker to be able to help them in terms of retraining.
I feel like as a young person also, I feel I can say this to you, but it's also, we need your knowledge. We need your knowledge and expertise of whatever industry that you've worked with to help us build these systems or to help us transition into the next economy or the next market or the next business model. I think that's something that I feel like we don't have a lot of knowledge in, but that's something that you can help build, because what applications and technologies are, it's knowledge plus math that creates a platform. And I think without the knowledge, then you have math that kind of operates in the abstract, and I feel like that's not a good system.
In terms of the numbers that you were talking about, up to 5 million workers may need to change professions, and between 3.5 and 6.5 million full-time equivalent positions could be displaced. Are those separate numbers? So is that 5 million and 6.5 million? So 5 million will be retrained?
The 5 million is a subset of the 6 million. It's just indicating that not everyone who loses their role will have to change profession. They may be in the same profession with some changes in tasks involved.
So do we need to talk about things or look at things like universal income, universal pay, because there will be people who will no longer be able to be employed?
Well, this is the interesting question as to, we have been quite successful at getting to quite high employment rates, notwithstanding the sort of some of the technology disruption going on. So we see there is a transitional issue in terms of how quickly people can get back into the workforce. But if you look at history, we've actually been pretty successful at people being able to get back into the workforce. So we would not jump into a universal basic income. We think some countries are trialling this, but the really important thing to focus on is a retraining.
And you've mentioned the policymakers. Without getting too political, are you a little concerned that as we're leading up to the next election, this is not an issue, is it, really? You're not hearing about it.
Well, we are hearing about it in terms of talking about employment and the creation of new jobs and where some of these jobs are coming from. I think we would like to hear a bit more about how do we think about managing the next 10 years rather than just the next 3 years, but that's certainly what we would like to see.
Erika, I just wanted to get your thoughts on youth unemployment. We've got fresh data out today. It's pretty bleak. It's 11.2% nationally, whereas overall the rate is around 5%. And in some regional areas in parts of Queensland, it's more than 20%. I mean, is that a gloomy outlook for you when you think of what the future will look like?
I think my answer to that is I'm not really sure about the context of youth unemployment in rural Queensland. But in terms of unemployment for youth, I feel like I can answer to that. And I think there's something about being actively learning and being open-minded about your learning and conscious about your learning that young people can do that can help with that.
And just very briefly, it's not just an age difference, it's also as far as a regional difference too, isn't it? Where you live in Australia is highly important.
Certainly we're seeing some variations because we've looked at this on a regional basis, and in some regional areas we're going to see a higher area of job displacement in things like mining and agriculture that we've talked about, and more so than in some of the urban areas. So there is a regional issue, and there is some areas of regional disadvantage which we talk about in the report, and which I think needs to be an area of focus.
Okay.
Well, it's something to be concerned about, but as you say, embrace the opportunity, because we don't have any choice, do we, really?
Absolutely.
$4 trillion sounds like a lot of money.
All right, Charlie and Erika, thanks so much.
That's all right. Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.